Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Whether you're tuning in from the Great American Bash or halfway around the world, we've got a jam-packed episode for you. Get ready to dive into wrestling's rich history, packed with insights, opinions, and a few surprises. And remember, you can skip to your favorite moments with our chapter markers. Let's jump right into it. July 31, 2000 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. WCW does big business in Australia, WWF fully loaded review, more. By Dave Meltzer. The country of Australia, apparently wrestling starved, banged out amazing business when tickets went on sale for an October tour of World Championship Wrestling, which includes 4 television shoots. On July 21st, the first show that went on sale, a Nitro taping in Melbourne on October 13th, sold out the Rod Laver Arena. Capacity for a Nitro taping would be probably close to 10,000. With tickets priced from $300 Australian down to $65. Sold out in less than 3 hours. Reports of a 90-minute sellout are exaggerated, but only slightly. No figures were available at press time, but because the majority of the seats were priced at $150, the gate, even in US dollars, Australian dollar is worth 58 cents US, may close in on the magic $1 million mark that no WCW event in history has topped. Probably will fall closer to $900,000, but we haven't been given breakdowns. 3 WCW shows in history, all during its hot period during the 6-month period between July 1998 and January 1999, topped the $900,000 mark, the record being January 4, 1999 Nitro at the Georgia Dome with $930,735 where, as it turned out, Kevin Nash laid down for Hulk Hogan with the dreaded one-finger blow. Can you imagine that the next time in the same building they had to paper like crazy and since have had to move to the Phillips Arena where they have to heavily paper as well? There is a lesson to be learned from all this, but maybe it's finally been learned. If not, that's a broken record at this point. The Australian tour will be a gigantic money maker. Nitro will be taped on October 7th, a Friday night, in Brisbane for the next Monday, while Thunder will be taped on October 9th for 2 days later. For the Australian market, the ticket prices are amazing, as the biggest regular season Australian rules football game, which took place on July 21st and sold out the 95,000-seat cricket ground in Melbourne, grossed quite a bit under $1.5 million Australian. There was some trepidation going in that the local promoters, the Paul Dainty organization, had priced the shows out of the market. The group paid WCW a flat $1.5 million fee for 5 dates plus had to cover expenses for all the major stars coming abroad for 1 week. October 7th Nitro taping in Brisbane for airing 2 days later, October 9th Thunder taping in Sydney for airing 2 days later, which was also a first-day sellout of a 10,000-seat building, a house show on October 11th in Perth, which had the weakest advance of the shows, and the double shot in Melbourne on October 13th and October 14th, which sold about 4,000 tickets at last word, for a Nitro and Thunder respectively. The local promoters made the call to charge prices well above what anyone would have thought possible to get, particularly since WCW's television in Australia isn't strong. It has a cable show, but cable is in less than 1 million homes total nationwide, so that's barely a blip along with its strong show, a 55-minute edited version of Nitro with C-Team commentary overdubs airing Monday nights on a network station which airs after midnight. It was a good call, at least for a first-time effort, because it's clear the country, which has a rich pro wrestling heritage, was starved for a major league promotion after roughly a full decade since the last WWF tour. Apparently the tour using former WWFers of years back headlined by Dennis Rodman, who supposedly was in Australia a few days earlier in the week, overslept his promotional appearances by partying too strong the previous night, which starts July 28th, didn't fit the wrestling fans' bill of Major League Pro Wrestling. However, charging those kind of prices, it becomes imperative the company delivers super shows, or they'll kill the market in one fell swoop. Australia had a major pro wrestling history for most of the last century, and many of the biggest name Americans have toured the country. Its peak period was in the late 60s under Jim Barnett, which was the original World Championship Wrestling promotion. By the late 70s, after Barnett had returned to the United States, it had faded down and never came close to recovering, although WWF did some good business with what would be considered C-Team type tours during its first boom period. Originally the Australian promoters only had October 13th date for Melbourne, a house show at the 54,000-seat Colonial Stadium, but it was moved indoors when WCW wanted to tape 2 more television shows on the tour. Tony Schiavone, Mark Madden and Mike Tenay will announce all 4 shows during the tour. WCW adjusted its house show schedule by canceling dates on October 2nd at the Cow Palace in San Francisco and October 3rd at the Long Beach Sports Arena, with the fear that running the Cow Palace with a 4:30 p.m. start time for a Nitro if the product stays cold could be scary. Brad Siegel made the decision that after the Australia tour, he wanted everyone to get a week off, which is why the October 12th and October 13th shows were made television tapings. The Nitro and Thunder tapings in Melbourne were originally set for October 16th and October 17th, in St. Paul and Fargo, North Dakota. Those cities have been moved up to October 2nd and October 3rd. The St. Paul show, which comes one day after the ECW pay-per-view show in the same city, ECW will be in the smaller 7,000-seat Roy Wilkins Auditorium, will be the first pro wrestling show in the new state-of-the-art home of the Minnesota North Stars, the XL Energy Arena, which because of the new arena and it being in the Central, as opposed to Pacific time zone, looks to be a much easier building to run. The entire crew will then have off from the second Melbourne show for 9 days until the Nitro taping on October 23rd in Little Rock. Sid Vicious represented WCW on the promotional tour and it was considered a success. The media liked him because he didn't try and pretend pro wrestling was a shoot, which is the usual turnoff for the media when it comes to dealing with pro wrestlers. In what many considered a throwaway show between King of the Ring and SummerSlam, the WWF put on arguably the best pay-per-view show of the year with fully loaded card on July 23rd from Reunion Arena in Dallas. Business figures for the show won't be available until next week's issue. After the first 6 matches, it seemed like just an average show, but the final 2 matches were as strong a pair of main event matches on any pay-per-view show in a long time. The show was totally built around 3 matches: Rock vs. Chris Benoit, Triple H vs. Chris Jericho, and Undertaker vs. Kurt Angle, with the idea that Benoit, Jericho and Angle were being put in key positions against the 3 major established stars of the company. During the show they had, during the undercard matches, on the video wall, a flashing screen over and over listing the 3 main events, which was annoying to a home viewer and probably slightly distracted the live crowd from the undercard matches going on in the ring with the attention being diverted. And all of the guys in their biggest break matches lost. Looked at it from a straight win-loss perspective, it seemed like WCW booking of the past few years or New Japan booking its April Tokyo Dome built around heavyweights versus junior heavyweights as the undercard theme. But I don't see how anyone can say in matches the quality of Rock vs. Benoit and Triple H vs. Jericho, that anyone lost. Not either wrestler, and certainly not the audience. Obviously, you can't say that for Undertaker vs. Angle, and in hindsight, I still can't think of anything positive to say about that match. It's a question of whether and how the losses are played and how Benoit and Jericho are positioned from this point on, and in the case of Benoit, it was clear on television the next night that the fans took him as more of a threat to Rock than ever before, so it appeared to be a success in elevating him with the loss because of the match quality. Helmsley, who made a strong case for positioning as this year's Wrestler of the Year, it's hard to argue with his being on top for some of the biggest money shows in the history of the industry and 4-star matches with Jericho 3 times now, Foley twice, Rock, Benoit, and even near 4-star matches with Taka and Rikishi on TV, equaled his performance in the Royal Rumble match with Mick Foley and his match against Jericho, which was going to have a hard time living up to the standard of their 2 previous singles matches on television. He went into the match with a sciatic nerve problem, giving him a lot of lower back pain and some numbness in his leg. The pain from the SmackDown match on July 18th was a flare-up of a previous injury and had lots of intense treatment leading up to the match. His back was said to have been very stiff going into the ring, but he was said to be in a lot less pain than earlier in the week. This stole the show with a match of the year caliber performance, which wasn't Jericho's flashiest, but may have been his best all-around major show singles match in American rings. Rock and Benoit weren't far behind, with a match that was even more solidly executed. The announcing of Jim Ross was top of the line, particularly in attempting, after Benoit's loss, to establish the match as the beginning of a feud for the ages as opposed to simply a pay-per-view main event where the champ won and now it's time for a new challenger. The reverse dusty finish by Mick Foley was good, but it did seem like the finish in the restart with Rock scoring the rock bottom for the pin was too quick. 1. Matt and Jeff Hardy and Lita, Amy Dumas, beat Test, Andrew Martin and Albert Matt Bloom, and Trish Stratus in 13-12. A good opener. Matt had one very rough spot early where he slipped on the ropes a couple of times trying to execute a spot. Test and Albert have really improved as far as work goes but are kind of lost in the shuffle as huge guys who aren't particularly charismatic. Lita has superstar potential in her tomboy role where she could be the first real hero to the teenage girl fan base as a real person as opposed to the fantasy figure of China. They have to be careful because the reason her moves look so spectacular is partially because she has a male base for her lucha spots, and none of the women in the WWF could make her stuff look as good, and like Chyna, being put in a lot of singles matches against men will only emphasize what she lacks. While her work with Stratus was better than anyone could hope for given Stratus' very limited training, although she clearly has the willingness to learn, and even her somewhat limited ring time. Still, although they were the focal point, they needed to only be in for limited time. Michael Zeitz, Hayes, and Tom Pritchard worked with them earlier in the week in setting up and running through their spots. They did a 3-on-2 suplex spot where Hardys and Lita suplexed Albert and Stratus. Albert pressed Jeff and dropped him over the top rope to the floor. Test did the meltdown to Matt, but Jeff delivered his swanton to Test. Lita did a tremendous tornado DDT then on Test and a real good plancha on Albert as well as a Hurricane Rana off the top on Test for a near fall. Finally, Test power-bombed in and tagged in Stratus. Lita superplexed Stratus with both standing on the top rope, which was kind of scary to watch given Stratus' lack of experience. Lita scored the pin on Stratus after a moonsault. After the match, Albert clotheslined Lita and Test laid out both Hardys with high kicks, leaving Stratus to whip Lita with a belt. 2 3/4 stars. They had 2 early show skits with several segments. In one, Undertaker kept chasing Angle around backstage. It was kind of silly because Undertaker was on his motorcycle and Angle was running away, yet Undertaker could never catch him. Later, Angle was fooling around with Undertaker's bike and Undertaker came chasing him. Undertaker doesn't move so well, so at least his not catching him that time was believable. Actually, Angle was able to lap Undertaker running around some wood and went from being chased to hitting him in the knee again with a wrench. The other skit was Stephanie McMahon getting all sorts of flowers, presumably from Angle. When Bruno Lauer was carrying more flowers and Triple H confronted him about where they came from, Triple H said he was going to kick Angle's ass, but instead got his ass kicked by Jericho. Aside from that, this was pure wrestling. 2. Taz, Peter Cernurka, beat Al Snow, Alan Sarvin, in 5:20. Little heat. Fans live saw this as something of a popcorn match. There was even a boring chant at one point. Snow did a good job in this basic match, including getting near falls after a leg drop off the top and a moonsault. He went for head, but Taz clipped him from behind, gave him a captured suplex and his choke submission, which Snow broke the first time, but couldn't break a second time. 1 1/4 stars. 3. Perry Saturn, Perry Sotelo won the European title from Eddie Guerrero in 8:10. Chyna chased Terry away from the ring and Saturn chased away Chyna. Guerrero looked very good here, with Hurricane Ranas coming from all directions. Saturn had a small cut on the top of his head. The finish saw Saturn clothesline Chyna through the Spanish announcer's table. Terry came back out and Saturn gave Guerrero a low blow and an elbow drop off the top rope to his back for the clean pin. 2 1/2 stars. 4. Acolytes, John Layfield and Ron Simmons, defeated WWF Tag Champs Edge, Adam Copeland, and Christian, J. Resso via DQ in 5:29. They did the bit earlier in the show where Christian was pretending to have the heaves and brought in a doctor and Commissioner Mick Foley, who they were able to work. But just before match time, Foley caught Christian in the act of pretending to throw up, climbing the wall so he could see into the bathroom stall, and Christian was so busted. Inc. did their mic work running down Texas. They talked about the JFK assassination, which took place in Dallas in 1963, saying he'd have killed himself if he had to spend any more time in Dallas. That was weird for 2 reasons. First, most of the WWF audience was not even close to born, and second, that isn't a subject really ripe for a lot of comedy. Bradshaw came out in probably his most inspired mic work in a long time, talked about this being the building where Dick Murdoch, Bruiser Brody, the Freebirds and the Von Erichs performed. I guess Murdoch is something of a hero to Bradshaw, because I can't ever recall Murdoch even wrestling at Reunion Arena unless it was at the tail end of his career during his short stint with the WWF. It was fast-paced and seemed to be building toward a decent match, except it ended abruptly with a terribly weak finish where Edge hit Farouk with one of the belts right in front of the ref. There was said to be strong consideration to putting Inc. over, but the decision was apparently made because this DQ finish did play into the main event stipulation and because Inc. had gotten the best of the feud at almost every turn leading up to the match. Finish still ruined the match. 1 1/2 stars. 5. Val Venus, Sean Morley, pinned Rikishi Solofafatu in 14:10 in a cage match. They both worked hard, but Rikishi is really a dancing gimmick with the stink face spot which doesn't lend well toward long matches. Venus appeared to have busted his eye hard way since the cut was at the side of the eye instead of the usual forehead. Rikishi did the banzai but Venus got his foot on the ropes. Rikishi went to escape the cage but straight slammed the door on his head. This was the same building where 18 years ago in the Flair vs. Kerry Von Erich match when Terry Gordy did that to Kerry, it popularized that finish, although I bet almost nobody in the building even remembers that finish. Venus did the money shot for a near fall. Lita came out and took Straight's shirt off and began whipping her back to the dressing room with a belt. Venus fell onto Teddy Long in a somewhat lame-looking ref bump. Rikishi then climbed to the top of the cage, which looked to be a good 9 feet, and teasing it literally forever, came off the top with a splash. That was one scary-looking spot, because you're talking about a 400-pound man doing the same spot a 240-pound Jimmy Snuka gave Jeff Jarrett a concussion doing. The ring may have broken or was at least damaged because some of the bumps later in the show had a clanging sound to them. Best sign of the night was Tanda equals Bradshaw and Rikishi. As Rikishi was going to leave, Taz came out and hit him with a television camera, and Venus got the pin. 2 3/4 stars. Shane McMahon challenged Rock to a non-title match, wearing a Rock Just Bring It t-shirt. That t-shirt is actually a reminder Rock is basically copying Scott Hall's catchphrase. Rock came out, which gave Benoit the chance to go into the dressing room and tear up all of Rock's clothes. 6. Undertaker Mark Calloway pinned Kurt Angle in 7:34. Undertaker destroyed Angle early, refusing to pin him on 2 occasions. Angle came back and worked on Undertaker's knee for a few minutes until Undertaker made the comeback, hitting a choke slam and his high-power bomb for the pin. They had one real good exchange of punches in mid-ring, but other than that, there was nothing to say positive about this match, and Angle really was booked to not look competitive. It was exactly what I expected, but I was still dumbfounded when it was over. 3/4 star. 7. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, beat Chris Jericho, Chris Irvine, in a last man standing match in 23:11. Jericho hit the springboard dropkick early and dominated early. Triple H cut him off by hot-shotting him on the security barricade and dropping him on the steps. Triple H pulled all the wrapping off Jericho's ribs, worked injury, and suplexed him on the floor. Jericho came back but Triple H got his knees up on the Lionsault. Triple H used a sleeper with a body scissors. They tried to paint the picture of Jericho being tough as he'd struggled to get up at 9. He got up after the pedigree at 9. Triple H used a chair to the ribs and back. Jericho came back with a chair shot and Triple H bladed big time. Jericho hit a missile dropkick and a facebuster on a chair, and then Triple H took a Harley race bump out of the ring. Triple H came back and went for a pedigree on the ring steps, but Jericho back flipped him over to the floor. Both hit each other with TV monitors for a double 9 count. Jericho blocked the pedigree and hit the walls, but Triple H made a rope break, but since this was last man standing, Jericho didn't have to break. Finally Stephanie came in, and Jericho dropped the walls on Triple H and put it on Stephanie. Triple H recovered and hit Stephanie with a clothesline to the back. Triple H then pulled out a sledgehammer from under the ring. Jericho managed to get it and use it to Triple H's guts. They ended up brawling outside and Triple H back suplexed Jericho through the American announcer's table. Both guys were down for the 9 count and Triple H rose and collapsed to win the match. 4.5 stars. 8. Rock, Dwayne Johnson, pinned Chris Benoit in 22:09 to retain the WWF title. These two had a real tough act to follow. This was a tremendously well-executed match. In that sense it was better than the previous match, although the other match had a better finish, built better and had more gimmicks associated with it. Benoit hit Rock with the title belt for a near fall. It was too early in the match for the fans to buy that one. Benoit used a sharpshooter but Rock got out. Shane pulled down the ropes and Rock took a bump over the top. Rock came back with a dragon screw into a figure 4. Shane distracted the ref and Benoit made the ropes. Shane clotheslined Rock twice outside the ring. At one point after they brawled in the stands, Benoit suplexed Rock back over the security barrier inside. Rock got near falls with a DDT and with a powerbomb-like maneuver dropped backwards into a hot shot. Benoit got a near fall with a diving headbutt. Rock hit the spinebuster in People's Elbow, but Shane distracted Earl Hebner and Benoit kicked out. Benoit got a near fall with a top rope superplex. What appeared to be the finish was Shane hitting Hebner with a chair. Rock then got the chair and Hebner acted like he didn't see it as he was recovering. With Hebner down, Rock got Benoit in the crossface and they did a total dusty finish with Hebner crawling over and signaling for the bell, like Rock had won with the move. Instead Hebner told Howard Finkel that he thought Rock hit him with a chair and DQ'd Rock, awarding the title to Benoit in 1928. Fans were starting to pelt the ring seeing what they thought was a title change using the dusty finish. Not so fast. Foley came back out and said that even though the title could change hands via DQ, he didn't see a DQ and ordered the match to continue. Benoit came out with a rolling German suplex for a near fall and got the crossface, but Rock made it to the ropes. Rock scored the pin rather suddenly after a rock bottom at 2:41 of the restarted match. It was an excellent main event, but it's still hard to make sense out of a storyline where Benoit, the heel who is in his first ever main event, gets laid out on Monday, taps out on Thursday, gets locked in his own hold for an apparent loss on the pay-per-view, but is handed the belt, only to get pinned cleanly a few minutes later. 4.25 stars. In an attempt to establish its style right off the bat, Mitsuharu Misawa's Pro Wrestling Noah promotion announced a two-day tournament on August 5th and August 6th with its new style going back to the 1970s NWA World Title Psychology. The top four wrestlers in the company, Misawa, Kenta Kobashi, coming back from double knee surgery far too quickly, Jun Akiyama and Akira Taue will meet in a tournament. It will start as a 2 out of 3 fall tag team match as the main event of the debut show on August 5th. The pairings will be announced later this week. The winning team members will then meet the next night. The original plan was to do a regular tournament with a pair of singles matches on August 5th and the winners advancing, but Kobashi is already returning far too quickly and it was best to use him. Actually, it's probably best not to use him in a tag team match. Although every territory had different rules, 2 out of 3 fall title matches were popular dating back to the turn of the century in pro wrestling. The switch to one fall main events around the world came largely during the 60s and 70s, for a number of reasons. One is doing the match kind of required the babyface to do at least one clean job, although the upside is that it accomplished that wrestlers' winning moves worked against the top stars, and also because the second falls became very difficult as time went on because anyone with half a brain knew that in 95% of the cases, the loser of the first fall will win the second. All Japan, like St. Louis, continued the 2 of 3 fall world title tradition well into the 80s. Ric Flair and Jumbo Tsuruta had a memorable 60 minutes match in 1983 where Tsuruta won one fall, but never won the second, so Flair retained the title long past when the rest of the wrestling world had abandoned it. All Japan Women even in recent years was the last major office outside of Mexico, where most of the matches except prelims throughout the country remained 2 of 3 falls, to continue this practice, usually for its tag team title matches. Also announced for the promotion's grand opening show are Yoshinari Ogawa and Masahito Kakihara and Daisuke Ikeda vs Takao Mori and Yoshihiro Takayama and Satoru Asako, Masao Inoue and Yoshinobu Kanemaru vs Kentaro Shiga and Masamichi Marufuji, Rusher Kimura and Mitsuo Momota and Takeshi Rikyo vs Haruka Eigen and Jun Izumida and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi and Takeshi Morishima vs Makoto Hashi. The Urban Wrestling Federation, which apparently is going to have strong national syndication, is running its first television tapings on August 19th and August 20th in Los Angeles, possibly at the Grand Olympic Auditorium. The idea of this promotion is to specifically target minority viewers by using minority stars in non-stereotypical roles and on the top of the shows, unlike has been traditional in WWF, Rock being the obvious exception, and WCW, they've done a 180 by reacting to the lawsuit. In particular African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexican Americans. For example, one of the stars, Tony Jones, will be pushed as a straight wrestler. The show will be a totally different concept, built not only around the wrestling performers, but hopeful of the wrestling to generate merchandising income through introduction of rappers as well as pushing dancing and concert-like entertainment mixed with the wrestling. The last attempt to push a new product through television syndication, WXO, lasted only a few weeks before the plug was pulled, and the odds of establishing a new promotion with no name value stars and a crew largely inexperienced past the indie level, and WXO had at least some wrestlers with name value from the past and many with major league experience, is certainly going to be a major challenge. The talent roster is mainly coming from the indie ranks, with nobody with any national star value coming in. Among the people expected to be pushed are Clarence McNatt, a 6'11", 340-pounder said to have strong charisma, Orlando and Marcus Jordan, Robert Thompson and Boyce LeGrand as a tag team, a team called the Puerto Rican SWAT Team, Jimmy Snuka Jr., son of the original, Jorge Estrada, a protege of Dusty Rhodes who has worked some ECW dates underneath, and former pro bodybuilder Aaron Baker, who had WWF and WCW tryouts. Jim Cornette has warrants out for his arrest on charges of aggravated assault and disorderly conduct stemming from an incident that took place on July 21 in Knoxville. Cornette has had a long-standing hatred for Terry Landell, a Knoxville promoter, based on warring over that area in the days of Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and recently nixed a work promotion versus promotion feud angle Landell had agreed to do with K-Town Showdown promoter Ron Welch, because Cornette was able to supply Fuller with WWF developmental talent, which ended up having the best matches on most of his Friday night shows. The incident apparently started when Cornette, who was in town scheduled to work for Fuller, found out that Landell was running a free show down the street in competition. Cornette drove over to Landell's show. Exactly what happened at this point is in question, although there were many witnesses. One report said Cornette was in his car yelling at Landell, who was standing there with a security guard and the guy who runs the merchandise table, and Landell sprayed pepper spray at Cornette. From all accounts, Cornette then went for a baseball bat while the other two men struggled with him. During the fight, Cornette apparently hit one of the men, identified in the police report as Mike Lynch, several times with the bat. While this was going on, Cornette's girlfriend Stacy Goff, Sin in Ohio Valley Wrestling, was chasing Landell, who was apparently running away and trying to spray her with pepper spray. When she got back in the car, with both starting to feel the effects of the pepper spray, Cornette allegedly ran over Lynch, who was treated on the scene, and sped off. Landell at his show the next night made little mention of the incident other than claim there were 4 warrants out for Cornette's arrest and that the local Channel 6 News would have a story on the incident, and also mentioned that in 1996, he bought the old SMW ring from Cornette, claiming that it was so Cornette would have enough money to get out of town. Paced by a huge second-hour pickup and one of the most watched matches in cable TV history, Raw drew a 6.89 rating, 6.18 first hour, 7.54 second hour, and a whopping 11.4 share on July 24. Nitro improved to a 2.83 rating, 3.04 first hour, 2.64 second hour, and a 4.7 share. The total wrestling audience grew to 10.4 million viewers, the best total in several weeks. It's really impressive that the Raw rating had sizable growth this week despite having competition from Nitro from the previous week, where it went unopposed. Raw's Rock and Kane vs. Benoit and Angle main event drew an 8.4 overrun. That translates into approximately 9,866,000 viewers, making it the 6th most watched match in the history of cable television. The all-time record remains on June 28, 1999 for an Undertaker vs. Austin match that drew 10,721,000 viewers. Nitro's T vs. Goldberg overrun drew a 3.1 rating. Head-to-head quarters saw Raw at 5.65, Foley interview with Benoit and Shane out to 2.52, Goldberg vs. T, Raw at 5.96, and a Foley interview with Benoit, Shane, and Stephanie Dog vs. Blackman to 2.47, Bagwell Canyon Angle Raw at 6.17, Shane and Stephanie vs. Show and Lita to 2.73, Douglas vs. Awesome, which had to be drawn by the T's sex tape of Tori Wilson, and Raw at 6.63, Godfather vs. Buchanan and beginning of Undertaker vs. Angle to 2.62, Caged Heat match and Goldberg throwing Ray through window pane. The special Tuesday edition of Nitro on July 18 drew a 2.36 rating, 2.00 first hour, 2.70 second hour, and a 3.9 share. The New Day was heavily hyped and they did present a strong show. Where WCW played it really wrong was they were hoping for Goldberg vs. Steiner to be a big ratings draw, and it was during its few minutes but wasn't enough to carry the entire show, but the mistake was in hinting it only to the internet audience, which is years away from being large enough to make a difference when you're talking about national ratings. They should have done an angle on Thunder and announced the match for Tuesday to get whatever ratings value giving away the match for free would have given them. The show's rating built throughout, which is the sign of a good show, peaking at 3.7 for the final 4 minutes of the Goldberg-Steiner match, which shows that there is money in that matchup if, and of course that's the big if, handled correctly. SmackDown on July 20th drew a 4.4 rating while Thunder on July 19th drew a 2.5. Other numbers over the weekend saw Livewire at 1.1, Superstars at 1.4, Sunday Night Heat at 2.7, WCW Blast Off at 0.7 and ECW on TNN at 0.9. The EMLL AAA Galavision show on July 18th drew a 1.6 Hispanic rating. A few notes regarding last week's issue and the future of the Observer. As we've seen with so many people in wrestling, the workload of trying to put out so much product on a weekly basis has taken its toll. With both WWF and WCW doing 2 primetime shows weekly and ECW, with nowhere close to the staffing, doing 2 weekly shows, we've seen evidence of fatigue in announcers, wrestlers, and production, and it's no different from this end trying to do so many things at once. I've been asking around a lot about what people like and least like about the publication, and what I least like about it, To create an easier publication to produce weekly and alleviate as much as possible the negative that doing an 18-page weekly publication and a daily radio show, not to mention a website, which is clearly a work in progress, and in order to do so much, having to rely on people who, for better or for worse, in many cases, it isn't in their blood to do anything more than keep things going rather than bring about changes necessary for everything to be successful. My own workload has also at times put me in the same position, and rather than hit the wall, some choices had to be made. It's basically trying to find a balance to keep this publication as strong if not stronger than ever while at the same time not fighting to stay awake doing other things. In talking with people about the Observer, the thing everyone says is the biggest plus is the analysis. You can get the news itself in many places, but the analysis and tying things together historically is the strongest point, and it's also the stuff I enjoy doing the most. The other thing people keep mentioning is that news on the web is here today and gone, but one of the reasons such a tiny percentage of readers, far fewer than I ever imagined, switched from subscribing to the print version to the online version is because people said they save their copies and look back, despite the obvious advantages both to me, no postage and printing costs, and theoretically for the readers, getting the Observers faster without having to worry about the inevitable post office screw-ups. It's important to cover the major news and emphasize it. To me, what isn't needed, particularly now, are pages of results and detailed television rundowns. They're available elsewhere, and really, TV shows are forgotten as soon as the next one comes up. A happy medium attempt right now is to keep the results of the major league shows, as well as any major shows from indie groups. We'll run down all the major details of the television shows, both here and in Japan, but as far as breaking down matches that don't mean anything or angles that don't mean anything to almost anyone the day after they happen, it's almost like a waste of space. Last week's issue, the first attempt to do this in a more sane manner, showed it can be done, on a somewhat slow news week, in 12 pages. Because of postage costs, if it can't be done in 12 pages during a week, it might as well be 18. And with the cutting down of results and some of the detailed TV rundowns, it'll result in more space for letters, and there will be more of a concentration on reporting on the big stories as opposed to trying to get so much largely trivial news in, which are usually more interesting than results of indie shows. This week the plan was for 18 pages, but for whatever reason, we didn't get either SmackDown or Thunder results in at press time. I expect to cut slightly back in MMA coverage, although the Pride promotion, since they often run in dome stadiums and are drawing largely from the pro wrestling fan base, has to today be considered one of the major league wrestling companies and will be covered as such. If UFC ever gets back in that realm, it will be as well, but I can't see doing much with UFC aside from coverage of the pay-per-view events. The pay-per-view rundowns for all companies will stay the same, because people do look back at pay-per-view shows, and we will run down the Japanese PPVs from the big companies as that becomes more of a part of that culture. The idea is to keep everything that anyone looking back for that week would want to know in the future, but the stuff that probably won't be as important looking back doesn't need to be here, particularly since it's available everywhere. The major companies, whether they be WWF, WCW, ECW, All Japan, PON, and New Japan coverage won't be affected as far as news goes. This is all in the experimental phrase, and your feedback on it is definitely welcome. Mexico. Sangre Azteca beat Pegaso in a mask versus mask match on July 23 at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City. Pegaso unmasked to reveal himself as Carlos Guevara Morales, 35, of Guadalajara. Pierroth Jr. got hit by a bottle thrown by a fan on July 19 in Acapulco and was so mad he got on the mic and did a speech saying that the fans should respect the wrestlers more. Brazo de Plata and Lismark Jr. and Negro Casas vs. Dr. Wagner Jr. and Shocker and Apollo Dantes was added to the August 4th pay-per-view show from Arena Mexico. The July 28th Arena Mexico main event is Rayo de Jalisco Jr. vs. Dr. Wagner Jr., and really little on the card builds for the pay-per-view the following Friday. Jake Roberts, it has been reported, will return to Mexico for the new MVS promotion that airs on TV Azteca. Roberts worked for AAA and was a phenomenal heel presence, although he was way past gone as a performer, for AAA 7 years back. Foligno suffered a double fracture to his jawbone, had surgery, and is out of action. All Japan. The July 23 Budokan Hall show drew a crowd announced at 16,300, although that was not a real number as the third deck had many empty seats. It was close to full, and considered a very good showing. The Tenryu and Kawada beating Hansen and Mossman main event ended with Kawada pinning Mossman after a powerbomb in a match where Mossman looked good. Reports were that overall it was not a good show, but that the crowd was very different from the usual very smart and critical Tokyo Big Show crowd. It appeared many people came to this show out of loyalty to the company and were much easier, including huge crowd responses underneath to the Kimala 2 vs Yuto Aima match for example, although they did hate the Shinobu vs Shiba Lucha Libre match on the undercard, including go home chants. The biggest reactions were to Hansen and Tenryu, which Kawada wasn't happy about. During the main event they teased problems with Tenryu and Kawada to set up their program with Kawada afterwards, saying it was a mistake to team with Tenryu and it would never happen again. The biggest crowd of the tour before the Budokan final was for the final show where the Noah wrestlers would appear on July 20th at Hakata Star Lanes, announced as a sellout 3,300, although I'm skeptical of that figure as the building is very small. Williams, who did the grandstand challenge for Misawa on the tour, went to shake Misawa's hand at the show but Misawa refused and went to the locker room. All Japan announced for the next tour from August 20th through September 2nd. Final night will be a Budokan Hall show. We'll have as foreigners, Hansen, Williams, Barton, Johnny Smith. The return of Sabu, plus will debut the Sedman, an indie wrestler from Texas, doing a UFC fighter gimmick. And Luchadores Super Colo, Super Parka, Halloween, and Damien, the latter four being there is a risk since Lucha Libre style goes totally against the All Japan style, and I could easily see All Japan fans laughing at the style. Tenryu and Nobutaka Araya will also work the entire tour. At this point the plan for the Budokan main event is to reunite Hansen and Tenryu as a team. They were the top team in All Japan in 1989, holding the double tag belts on 3 occasions as part of a 3-way main event program that year against Jumbo Tsuruta and Yoshiaki Yatsu, and Williams and Terry Gordy, to face Kawada and Williams. The bad news coming out of Budokan is that the loyalty factor only goes so far, and that there are tons of tickets remaining for the August 20th Korakuen Hall show. Motoko Baba's main goal is to keep the thing alive, with the goal being to at least hit the 30-year anniversary, which would be the fall of 2002. Pro Wrestling Noah. Vader will start on the October tour. The early shows will be Japanese natives only. At this point Vader is the only foreigner signed with this promotion. Misawa announced that he'd be joining with Yoshimoto Productions, which owns Osaka Pro Wrestling, to help them promote Osaka area house shows. Noah undercard wrestlers Masao Inoue and Yoshinobu Kanemaru defeated FMW's Wu Tag Team champs Gedo and Jado on July 23rd at Differ Ariake to set up a title match between the same teams on July 28th at Korakuen Hall. July 12th TV show drew a 2.6 rating. New Japan. As expected, it was officially announced after weeks of working the angle that the Riki Choshu vs Atsushi Onita match on July 30th, the main event of the company's first ever pay-per-view show, will be an electric dynamite match. Both Masahiro Chono and Hiroyoshi Tenzan have already challenged the winner. They announced a July 20, 2001 date for the 50,000-seat Sapporo Dome. They ended the tour on July 20th in Sapporo before 8,200 with 2 title changes, as Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima won the tag titles from Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi in 21:33 when Nakanishi was pinned after Tenzan's diving headbutt and Kojima's lariat, and Tatsuhito Takaiwa pinned Jushin Liger to win the IWGP Junior title for the first time in his career in 1634 with a Death Valley Bomb. Liger said that he now wants to wrestle as a heavyweight and challenge for both the singles and tag team titles. The main event saw Kensuke Sasaki pin Takashi Iizuka to retain the IWGP Heavyweight title in 2030 with a Northern Lights bomb. It was announced that Atsushi Onita broke his ribs on July 13th in the match with Sanshiro Takagi but still wrestled on his own show on July 20th, doing the Great Nita gimmick for the first time since the Muta match at Yoyogi Stadium last summer, at which point the character supposedly had died. They did a backstage angle where Nagata and Yutaka Yoshi supposedly had a fight, which means they are already breaking up the G-Eggs group. They are down now until the G1 tournament starts. The tournament has weak advances in every city, even Hiroshima, which has never housed a G1 show in history. Caught the July 9th Kashin and Liger vs Sasuke and Hamada tag match from Hirosaki, Kashin's hometown, which aired on the July 15th New Japan TV show. It wasn't nearly what you'd expect from such a dream match. Sasuke worked much of the way, and he's not that good in the ring anymore. He did a fantastic running dive over the top, crashing his ankle on the guardrail. He missed a lot in the ring. Liger can't do a lot either. Hamada was actually the best wrestler in the match and he's about to turn 50. Kashin got to beat Sasuke with the flying armbar submission. Other Japan notes. The Crush Gals return as a tag team once again as Crush 2000 against Asia Kong and Dynamite Kansai to headline the September 15th Gia show at Yokohama Bunka Gym. They did an angle on July 22nd at Korakuen Hall where Kong and Kansai beat Nagayo, through destroying partner Sonoko Kato, and after the match Linus Asuka ran in and issued the challenge. Kenichiro Arai won the NWA welterweight title from Suwa for the Toryuman Group on July 22 at Differ Ariake before 1,522 fans. FMW announced a crowd of 1,800 in the same building the next day. The idea was H would go back to being Hayabusa and he'd have 10 singles matches, and if he won all 10, he'd get the Wu title from Koto Fuyuki. Hayabusa beat Flying Kid Ichihara, 19 seconds, Chocoball Mukai, 3 seconds, Mr. Ganasuke did the Sandman gimmick of drinking beers at ringside, and passed out so he couldn't wrestle, Kintaro Kanimura, Yoshinori Sasaki, Hideki Hasaka, Goemon, Kyoko Inoue. Fuyuki made himself the 9th guy. Jinsei Shinzaki attacked Hayabusa leading to Fuyuki pinning him. Masato Tanaka returned and made the save and they'll form a team. The 10th guy was FMW owner Shoichi Arai, who never had to wrestle. Caught the Tenryu vs Shinobu Kondori match, and was it ever different than the men vs women stuff in this country? It was really something to see a 270-pound man, even as old as Tenryu, throw full force chops on a woman, even one as tough as Kondori. Tenryu mounted her and threw stuff open hands and punches to swell the left side of her face up something really bad. It looked more like a boxer who had taken a terrible beating than someone doing a blade job in a pro wrestling match. Most of the Big Japan stuff is really bad, in particular the Combat Zone guys, but they've got a junior heavyweight dressed up like Jeff Hardy who looked really good. It was really sick also as one of the Japanese guys did a senton off the 18-foot balcony at Korakuen Hall through a table. Here and there. Gordon Solie, who in his day, 60s and 70s, was the man when it came to announcing pro wrestling, is in very rough shape as the cancer that robbed him of his famed voice has spread to his brain. 2 generations of Floridians grew up listening to Solie's voice, which was also well known in the Northeast, since Florida wrestling was syndicated into New York for many years, and Georgia, later nationally as the voice of Georgia Championship Wrestling in the early years when it exploded as the highest-rated show on cable television in the early 80s. Half the wrestlers in the business would imitate his own announcing catchphrases, or Solieisms, such as the Pier 6 Brawl. His face has become a veritable crimson mask. He'd fight a buzzsaw and give it the first 2 rounds and he's all man and a yard wide. Solie is one of only 5 announcers, along with Dick Lane, Jim Ross, Jimmy Lennon Sr. and Lance Russell, in the Observer Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame. This past week, several of his longtime friends including wrestlers Jack Briscoe, Steve Kieran and Brian Blair and baseball star Wade Boggs went out with him largely to make sure they'd all get together at least one time. Briscoe was scheduled for intestinal surgery this week to correct a problem he's been battling for the past 18 months, and at one point was also in very rough shape. During treatment previously, a nerve was cut which destroyed part of his intestine which he needed removed. He was scheduled for about a 5-day hospital recovery and 3 to 4 months with a colostomy bag, but after that should recover and become the healthiest he's been in years. In the July 10th Observer story on NCAA champions that have gone pro and Vern Gagne being one of the few $100,000 per year athletes in the country in the early 50s, we're told the list we had of wrestlers from that period who earned 6 figures of Gagne, Luthez and Argentina Rocca was incomplete, and that in their best years at Yukon Eric, Hans Schmidt, Killer Kowalski and Pat O'Connor all earned more than $100,000. I'd certainly have to assume Gorgeous George in his best years earned more than that as well, as the guy used to light his cigars with $50 bills at his peak. That also explains why a man who could command 40% of the house to come to a city and was one of the biggest mainstream stars the industry ever produced, died penniless at the age of 47. The Orlando Sentinel on July 14th ran a Where Are They Now? Story on Bob Orton Jr. Orton Jr., 49, said he retired from pro wrestling for good after the Heroes of Wrestling pay-per-view show and now is selling used cars outside St. Louis. He mentioned that while he doesn't like today's wrestling, his son, Randy, 20, has signed a developmental deal with WWF. He's in Louisville regarding the burning down of the Hart Guest House. Police arson unit detective Rod McRae said he thought it was deliberately set to cause damage, but said he didn't believe it was meant to burn the house down. Surprisingly, Sue Hart was quoted as saying, "It's in the family, you might say, but I haven't got the guts to make a big deal out of it. There are some shakeups in Stampede Wrestling." Ross Hart quit after a board meeting on July 17th, although he was still running the house show on July 21st. There has been some unrest among the wrestlers because Stampede has drawn poorly and many are behind on pay, but Stampede still flew in Sabu and his entourage, including Josh Lazia, ex-PW. It appears Sabu Lazia and Bruce Hart are trying to put together a sort of international alliance where they'd make Sabu an old-style touring world champion and he'd work XPW, Stampede and Lincoln, the promoters in England and Australia Sabu has done business with. Bruce and Stampede TV producer Graham Owen went to the XPW show this weekend in Los Angeles. Stampede is also trying to put together a combined show with WWF on September 8th at the Corral, which may be official by the time you read this. This would be the same show they were going to do in May that flamed out because of all the negative publicity from other wings of the Hart family, since it was to involve a birthday for Stu and some sort of a memorial for Owen. At least that's how it was sold to some of the wrestlers, and many of the top WWF wrestlers immediately signed up for that reason. The idea now is to make the show some sort of a Brian Pillman benefit and keep Owen and Stu's name totally out of it. At the July 21st non-TV taping in Calgary before just 80 fans, Phil Lafond aka Dan Crawford, 39, wrestled for the first time in more than 1 year. He did nothing risky but was said to be in decent shape. Davey Boy Smith did a run-in when son Harry was getting double-teamed. Jim Neidhart was there in his new role as WWF scout. Basically a way to keep him on the payroll until the Owen case is settled is what it certainly looks like from the outside. The wrestler Frank Einstein in that group is Carl LeDuc. Jacques Rougeau will be wrestling King Kong Bundy during halftime of a Montreal Alouettes CFL game on August 3rd, the day after the two headline a Rougeau show. Kurt Hennig, now that he's done with WCW, technically he's still under contract but isn't being used and they haven't given him any impression they will bring him back, has been added to that Dennis Rodman wrestling tour of Australia from July 28th to August 13th. The advances for the show's Rodman is to headline against Brutus Beefcake look to be a bomb, but not as bad a bomb as some were predicting. For history's sake, Stevie O'Hay wrote us in a letter that the famous 1906 Frank Gotch vs. Fred Beal match where Gotch lost after hitting his head on the ring post and being counted out story was in fact a story reported for decades but isn't true. The ring they wrestled in had no ropes, nor had a ring post. Gotch also wasn't counted out of the ring, but was pinned in the third fall after hitting his head on the floor, being revived, and getting back into the ring, according to a report in the Chicago Tribune the day after the December 1, 1906 match in New Orleans where Gotch lost what is generally nowadays referred to as the American Heavyweight title, although it was billed as the World Heavyweight title at the time. It also should be noted, because the truth is, nobody really knows anything for sure about that period because everyone around during that period has long since died, that newspaper accounts of matches in those days can't be considered any more accurate than newspaper stories you read today about pro wrestling. Gotch regained the title 16 days later in a rematch in Kansas City. In the Knoxville Promotional Wars on July 14th, Ron Fuller's K-Town Showdown drew 1,000 for a Bob Armstrong vs. Jim Cornette and Robbie D. Loser Leaves Town match. Bob lost, said a close friend would be coming back looking for revenge, while Tennessee Mountain on the Street drew 500 to 600 for a free show headlined by Tommy Rich. Rock and Roll Express, who worked the early Ron Fuller shows, as well as Ron's brother Robert, are working for TMW, and Morton even went on TMW's public access TV show to run down Fuller. K-Town is scheduled to run weekly through September 1st, then take a break for the fair. Originally Fuller only committed to running Friday night shows all summer, but now is considering running indoors at the Coliseum starting in late September. The XPW show at the Los Angeles Sports Arena on July 22nd drew an estimated 1,100, roughly double what they'd been averaging, but it was also mostly papered, for the Sabu vs. Terry Funk match. They handed out tons of free passes for the tapings and were totally paranoid about ECW fans in attendance. One fan said he was specifically told coming in that any pro-ECW chance would get him ejected. XPW itself wrote all sorts of anti-ECW and Paul Heyman signs, most of them crude, and encouraged people to take them, giving the impression they were more concerned with blasting Heyman than putting on a wrestling show. 4 fans chanting ECW were asked to leave early on. Owner Rob Black cut a promo on Heyman claiming they were going to sue ECW for assault and went on for 10 minutes. The cameraman during crowd shots specifically told the fans to chant ECW sucks. The storyline for the main event was Black was bringing Funk in from WCW to get at Sabu. Black tried to get Funk to participate in the anti-ECW festivities, but he just stared across the ring and looked like he would rather be somewhere else, and they had their usual match. Several reports we got from people who got freebies said the show was terrible, including some non-ECW fans who felt that instead of putting on a good show to entertain the crowd, they felt used by a promotion trying to use the crowd to be their Hollywood extras. Supreme vs. Messiah were praised for trying hard and risking maiming themselves with thumbtacks, light bulbs, bed of nails and barbed wire, ending with a bump on what looked like a circus net of barbed wire. They are moving their next big show from the sports arena to the much smaller Shrine Expo Hall. Jeff Peterson, a Florida-based indie wrestler who was stricken with cancer, came to the Aqua, promoted by his uncle, Jim Kettner, for the show over the weekend between treatments to a huge fan ovation. Former wrestler Rick Oliver, who I'd guess to be about 48, suffered a severe heart attack this past month according to the latest Ring Around the Northwest newsletter. Oliver was the top heel in the old Don Owen, Oregon territory for most of the 80s, and retired in 1991 as the full-time aspect of Oregon wrestling was going down, I believe to work in logging, and never looked back. Oliver broke Lonnie Main's record by holding the old Pacific Northwest title 12 times between 1982 to 91. MMA. Dreamstage Entertainment officially announced 3 more matches for its August 27th Seibu Dome show: Kazushi Sakuraba vs. Renzo Gracie, Tokumitsu Ishizawa, Kendo Kashin vs. Ryan Gracie, and Vitor Belfort vs. Daijiro Matsui at a press conference on July 24th. They also announced singles matches with no opponents for Mark Coleman and Masaaki Sadake. The Sakuraba match at least has a storyline since he's beaten Royler and Hoist Gracie and now faces Renzo, who has never lost in Pride, although lost via decision to Kiyoshi Tamura earlier this year in rings. A few hours before the DSE press conference, New Japan's Tatsumi Fujinami announced that Kashin would fight at the Seibu Dome but said it would be a one-time appearance. Ryan Gracie is something of a black sheep in the family due to his recent legal entanglements and has never fought professionally. Ishizawa, who will be 32 when the fight comes up, was a former national champion wrestler and a 1992 Olympic hopeful before joining New Japan in 1993. He is well known among wrestlers for being great with submissions, and has trained in Brazil and does a submission gimmick in pro wrestling. New Japan is risking a lot here because his striking experience is likely lacking and submissions are less prevalent these days as the fighters are better schooled, but one would think Ishizawa should be able to handle him as far as basic wrestling goes. Matsui is clearly a guy to give Belfort another impressive win to hopefully set him up for a money fight. The show has some interesting matches, but it seems terribly weak for a show that is in a domed stadium. Rings ran its second U.S. show on July 22nd at the NBC Arena in Honolulu. In the heavyweight tournament, Tom Sauer scored 2 wins, including a 35-second knockout over Valentin Overeem, to advance into the September 26th Rings American Finals in Moline, Illinois, being joined by Eric Pele, who advanced from this show, and Tsuyoshi Kosaka and Bobby Hoffman from the show last week in Orem, Utah. In the under 200 division, 2 Rings regulars, Yasuhito Namikawa and Hiromitsu Kanehara advanced, joining Jeremy Horn and Chris Haseman in the finals on Moline. K1 will be holding a one-night 8-man tournament on August 20th at the Yokohama Arena with first-round matches of Ray Sefo vs. Frank Otto, Peter Aerts vs. Cyril Abidi, who upset Aerts with a first-round knockout 2 weeks ago, Francisco Filio vs. Tsuyoshi Nakasako, and Alexei Inishov vs. Matt Skelton. Pancrase has a deal with BS Asahi starting in December with the company's biggest show in years at Budokan Hall, which will be the Masakatsu Funaki retirement show on December 1st. He will have a ceremony, but he won't be fighting. The contract lasts through March of 2002 for digital broadcasting of high-definition TV. Pancrase held afternoon and evening shows on July 23rd at Korakuen Hall, drawing 2 full houses. The shows were built around matches in 3 different tournaments, and the atmosphere was said, with grapplers coming from so many different gyms and clubs, to resemble an amateur wrestling meet more so than the pro wrestling world which originally spawned this company. The Neo Blood tournament came down to Pancrase's Daisuke Watanabe and Yuji Hoshino of Real Japan Wrestling, who will face each other on August 27th in Osaka for the tournament final. In the middleweight tournament, Americans Shoni Carter and Chris Lytle each won their matches to advance to a Final Four on September 24th at Yokohama Bunka Gym, along with Kiyuma Kunyoku and Nathan Marquardt, who had already qualified. In the light heavyweight division, Brian Gassaway of the U.S. and Ikuiza Minowa, who looked impressive with submission wins in 142 and 132, advanced to the Yokohama show and will be joined by Omar Bauchi of Sweden and Kei Yamamiya in a Final Four tournament. After Yuki Kondo's win over Don Theodore in 308 with a knee bar, he issued challenges to both Naoya Ogawa and Rickson Gracie. All Japan. Mitsuharu Misawa agreed that the wrestlers who left the company, with the exception of those out with injuries like Kena Kobashi, would work the 4 shows in question where tickets and local publicity had already gone out with their names advertised. The 4 dates are regular house shows that had been sold to local promoters on July 13th in Matsuyama, July 15th in Nanao, July 16th in Toyama, and July 20th at the Hakata Star Lanes in Fukuoka. The stipulations given for them to appear is that Misawa will make the matches for everyone in his group, and that there will be no mixed matches involving either Masafuchi or Toshiaki Kawada against anyone from his group, but that Misawa's group's members will wrestle against each other or wrestle against the foreign crew. As things have turned out, Toshiaki Kawada has booked the shows for all 4 nights without Misawa's wrestlers. Misawa later announced matches with his wrestlers against one another. Kawada's main events on the shows are July 13th with Jinsei Shinzaki and Manukia Mossman and Kawada vs. 2 Cold Scorpio and Johnny Smith and Steve Williams. Misawa's matches are Misawa and Yoshinari Ogawa and Masao Inoue vs. Takao Mori and Yoshihiro Takayama and Takeshi Morishima, Rusher Kimura and Mitsuo Mamoto and Makoto Hashi vs. Haruka Eigen and Jun Izumida and Tsuyoshi Kikuchi and Akira Taue and Kentaro Shiga vs. Jun Akiyama and Yoshinobu Kanemaru. July 15th, Kawada and Mossman vs. Johnny Ace and Mike Barton. Misawa's main event is Misawa and Ogawa and Masamichi Marufuji vs. Akiyama and Izumida and Kanemaru. July 17th is Kawada and Shinzaki vs. Williams and Wolf Hockfield. Misawa's main event is Misawa and Ogawa and Marufuji vs. Taue and Inoue and Shiga. And July 20th as Kawada and Fuchi vs. Smith and Yoshiaki Fujiwara. Misawa's main event is Misawa and Ogawa vs. Taue and Inoue. Misawa also said that All Japan must provide his wrestlers with a different hotel than the hotel Kawada and Fuchi will be staying at, and that they won't travel with either Kawada and Fuchi in the same bus or in the All Japan Foreigners bus. Kobashi had his knee surgery on June 22, which took all day, and is hopeful of being back for the debut of the new promotion in August, which sounds like he's pushing it badly. There has been no talk at all about the title situations, and it appears they are basically all done with. Kobashi had the Triple Crown, and he's done with the promotion, so he'll never lose it. Kawada and Taue held the double tag titles, and even though both are working matches on the tour, they can't work with each other since they're with different companies, so they can't lose the belts in the ring. Ogawa holds the junior strap but can't drop it to Fuchi since the two sides aren't working together. Inoue and Honda hold the tag titles, and Honda is injured now anyway. Clearly, by not announcing a Budokan Hall show at all, they are scampering for something that can be a headliner. Although this was expected, referee Joe Higuchi, a staple of the All Japan front office from the start of the company, announced on June 26 he was siding with Misawa. Misawa officially announced that the owners of the new Diffa Ariake building are one of his sponsors, and that they would be opening up the company office in the building as well as the company dojo as a part of the building. All of this was somewhat known some time back. Misawa said the new company would use Budokan Hall for its big shows, trying to continue the All Japan tradition and transfer it to the new group, which has most of the employees from All Japan. In what may be the final tour for the All Japan company, besides the regular foreigners as well as Kawada and Fuchi, appearing on the tour will be Shinzaki, Michinoku Pro, Shigeo Okamura, Andy Udo Aima, West Japan, Fujiwara, a semi-retired legend type, Alexander Otsuka, Battle Arts, Muhammad Yone, Battle Arts, Takashi Hijikata, Battle Arts, and Shinobi, Vamos Promotion. The opening night on July 1st in at Diffa Ariake building will be Kawada vs. Fuchi, Williams and Hockfield vs. Barton and Ace, Fujiwara and Okamura vs. Shinzaki and Smith, Mossman vs. Aima and Giant Kimala 2 vs. Scorpio. The next day at Korakuen Hall's Samurai TV taping will be Kawada and Mossman vs. Ace and Barton, Williams vs. Smith, Shinzaki vs. Scorpio, Hockfield vs. Kimala 2 and Fuchi vs. Okamura. July 9th at Korakuen Hall Samurai TV taping is Kawada and Mossman vs. Fujiwara and Yone, Williams and Kimala 2 vs. Ace and Barton, Fuchi and Okamura vs. Otsuka and Smith, Shinzaki vs. Scorpio, Hockfield vs. Aima and Hijikata vs. Shinobi. July 11th in Osaka will be Kawada and Mossman vs. Otsuka and Shinzaki, Fuchi vs. Fujiwara, Williams vs. Yone, Ace and Barton vs. Kimala 2 and Smith, Hockfield vs. Okamura and Scorpio vs. Hijikata. None of the matches involving Misawa talent has been announced, nor has anything been announced for July 23rd at Budokan Hall. Atsushi Onita called Motoko Baba and said he would wrestle for All Japan to help save the company. Baba later said she thanked Onita for his offer and the two have talked on the telephone. Onita actually started at the age of 15 in the All Japan dojo and stayed with the company from 1974 through 1985, wrestling in both the US, Japan and Puerto Rico, often as the tag team partner of Masafuchi, and had a big junior heavyweight title feud with Chavo Guerrero. He retired, after losing a retirement match for the first time, due to bad knees, and then came in 1989 as the Blade Freak, introducing the Memphis heavy blood and gimmick style of wrestling to Japan, which made him into a celebrity. Nippon TV for its upcoming TV show went to Korakuen Hall on June 25th to interview the New Japan wrestlers for their thoughts on the start of the Misawa promotion. NTV also asked All Japan to tape July 1st as the debut of the new Diffa Ariake building, but All Japan decided against it, since the show would really be used to promote Misawa's group. While Misawa has yet to confirm this, there's a lot of speculation in wrestling that his company is being sponsored by the Gulliver Used Car Company in Japan, which is also the company behind the new building where Misawa's office and dojo will be on. The number of people who jumped from All Japan to Misawa totaled 25 wrestlers and 18 front office workers. Misawa announced, since his own trademark is green and silver, from his ring outfit, that the new group would wrestle in a green ring with silver ring posts. Naoto Morishita, the president of Dream Stage Entertainment, will be going to the All Japan July 1st show at Diffa Ariake trying to work out some sort of interpromotional business with All Japan, but I can't even imagine what they could do. It's long since past the day when someone like Steve Williams could walk into a UFC only using his natural toughness and the fact he was once a great amateur wrestler and just through size, overpower smaller martial arts guys. Honda's knee surgery is set for mid-July and he probably won't be back until November. New Japan. On the opening day of the new tour on June 25th at Korakuen Hall, Minoru Tanaka and Koji Kanemoto won the IWGP Junior Tag titles, beating Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani in 1825 when Tanaka made Otani submit to an armbar. In a major break from tradition, they put this match in the main event slot on the card and it was said to be really good. New Japan held its annual stockholders meeting on June 26th in Tokyo. Kiyoshi Sagawa, the president of Sagawa Express Truck Business Corporation, equivalent to UPS in the United States, is the company's top stockholder, now owning 85% of the company. The current positions in the hierarchy stay the same. Seiji Sakaguchi is chairman of the board. Tatsumi Fujinami is president. Tetsuo Baisho, Inoki's former brother-in-law, is managing director. The directors are Mitsuo Yoshida, Riki Choshu, Masa Saito, Natsuji Nagashima, Yasuji Sakaguchi, Fumiko Uwe, head of promoting local house shows, Hideki Yamanaka, in charge of TV and soft business, and Hideharu Motegi, TV Asahi liaison. Sakaguchi announced at the meeting that in March the company would promote its 30th anniversary card. The company debuted March 6, 1972 with a Karl Gotch vs. Antonio Inoki match in Tokyo. This coming March and that he, now 58, would do an exhibition match on the show and wanted to face Antonio Inoki, since they were the two biggest stars in the early days of the company. Sakaguchi had retired in 1990. Inoki in Tokyo Sports suggested that Shinya Hashimoto start wrestling for All Japan to help save the group. He said at this point there is no point in doing All Japan versus New Japan matches because All Japan has so little. It had to happen. The Survivor Series finish came to New Japan. Chono, claiming to be commissioner, ordered a tag title match with Yuji Nagata and Manabu Nakanishi defending against Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Satoshi Kojima on June 27 in Nagaoka after the regular card was over. Chono refereed, did a quick count, told Norton to ring the bell, grabbed the belts and gave them to Tenzan and Kojima. This isn't the WWF, so it isn't going to hold up as a title change. Yutaka Yoshi hit the ring and stole the belts then from Tenzan and Kojima. Other Japan notes. FMW officially announced changing its PPVs from DirecTV, which in Japan has merged with Sky Perfect TV. Starting with the July 28 Korakuen Hall show, FMW will run monthly pay-per-views at the cost of about $8. FMW did a couple of title changes over the past week. On June 21 at Korakuen Hall, Matty Smalls and Fatu, the brother of Rikishi, won the Wu Hardcore Tag titles over Hideki Hasaka and Yoshinori Sasaki. In the main event on that show, Benichiro Tenryu returned under a mask as Hayabusa, teaming with H, original Hayabusa, and Riki Fuji and Tetsuhiro Kuroda to beat Koto Fuyuki and Kyoko Inoue and Mr. Ganasuke Goemon Koji Nakagawa. Fuyuki unmasked Tenryu, who came back and pinned Fuyuki after a power bomb. Tenryu then stormed out of the building and drove away. Fuyuki then said he would go to the war show on July 13 at Korakuen Hall looking for revenge. On June 26 in Isazaki, the six-man titles changed hands with H and Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Hisakatsu Oya winning over Koto Fuyuki and Chocoball Mukai and Kyoko Inoue. Wellington Wilkins Jr., who is not the former Calgary wrestler Beef Wellington, although the two are constantly being confused, remains in jail in Tokyo on drug trafficking charges and won't even have a hearing until August. Wilkins, who was let go by Michinoku Pro upon news of the arrest breaking, has received no help nor legal assistance from the promotion. Daijiro Matsui, with Kazushi Sakuraba and his corner of the Takada Dojo fought in San Jacinto, California at the King of the Cage show in the main event against former UFC fighter Todd Medina and got pounded badly. LLPW announced the top 2 matches for its July 2nd show at Diffa Ariake, which opens on July 1st with an all-Japan house show, as Genichiro Tenryu vs Shinobu Kandori and Eagle Sawai vs Norio Tadano. All Japan Women is booking the same building that day. On the Michinoku Pro Show on June 25th in Namie, Great Sasuke retained the NWA middleweight title, pinning Masaaki Mochizuki, doing one of those double pin finishes, with Sasuke just getting his shoulder up, and Tiger Mask retained the British junior title, beating Pentagon from AAA with an armbar submission. Among those appearing on the CMLL Japan Tour from July 29th to August 6th are Mil Mascaras, Dos Caras, Atlantis Tarzan Boy, Tigre Blanco, Ricky Marvin, Starman Grand Marcus Jr., Pierroth Jr., Fuerza Guerrera, Ultimo Guerrero, Pimpinela, Virus, Fugaz, Archangel, Enigma, and Max Bunny. It looks like there will be an explosive barbed wire match in Tokyo, with Onita facing Sanshiro Takagi on July 25th. Here and there. In regards to the item in last week's issue regarding the PTC/WWF controversy, over the past week the PTC has removed its link to Toys R Us and no longer indirectly gets revenue from sales through its website of WWF and ECW action figures through Toys R Us. There is still one PTC link to International Collector Society, which sells WWF collector stamps. The June 25th Combat Zone Wrestling show in Philadelphia with Atsushi Onita and Terry Funk, that was supposed to be taped for a pay-per-view, was cancelled on June 21st. The public reason is that they are claiming they were shut down by the Pennsylvania State Athletic Commission, but at the time of the cancellation there were still second-row ringside tickets available, and it wasn't exactly a cheap show between Onita, the Explosives, and flying in all of Onita's crew from Japan. The show was in fact technically shut down by the commission, not because of the nature of the show or content, but because the promoters had never even applied for a license and been bonded, which is basically the only thing promoters are required to do in Pennsylvania when they have a show, is have a promoter's license and be bonded for $10,000, neither of which these promoters had. Technically, the only restrictions Pennsylvania has by law as to the content of a wrestling show is that wrestlers cannot intentionally cut themselves to produce blood, which was basically an agreement the WWF made with the state when they got the commission nixed, since at the time, the WWF was under the impression that as far as its purposes were concerned, blading was something out of wrestling's past. Of course, things have changed, and that lone restriction on content has never been enforced, but it is still on the law books. The show was moved to a soccer stadium on June 25th in Sewell, New Jersey, but no longer as a pay-per-view taping. The Japanese canceled the trip, with the story being told that they refused to do the show if it was in New Jersey. Terry Funk was told the commission shut down the show, so his appearance was canceled by the promoters, even if they were canceled in Pennsylvania, because wrestling isn't regulated in New Jersey. Until the new law comes in, they would be able to do the show. The fact they did a show indicates that, and thus the cancellations appear to be at least partially, if not primarily, based on the poor advance and the fact the show was going to be a huge money loser. Onita claimed he didn't come into the Japanese press that if he had come into Philadelphia that he and all his wrestlers were told they weren't going to be arrested, which is clearly a worked story, so in some form there is more to this than is being said. Leroy Miller, an independent wrestler in West Virginia, passed away on June 24th from complications after undergoing knee surgery the previous day. Miller, who was 6'6" and 425 pounds, wrestled under names such as Widowmaker and DOA starting in late 1995 for various groups including Mason-Dixon Wrestling in West Virginia and the Mid-Eastern Wrestling Federation in Maryland. The July 1st issue of Sports Illustrated is scheduled to have a short story on myself and this publication. Beyond the Mat opens for a limited release in the United Kingdom on June 30th in cinemas in London, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Birmingham. There were several very strong reviews for it in England, as were the Canadian reviews of a few weeks ago, the best written being in the June 24th issue of The Guardian. The Daily Oklahoman on June 27th ran an article on Bill Watts, who, in regards to today's wrestling, said, "I think the thing has lost all moral responsibility. I realized I couldn't be a part of it any longer. You can see the influence it has on our youth." Watts in particular cited the usage of the women in wrestling, the steroids and the language used. Watts is now selling diet supplements in Bixby, Oklahoma. The story didn't talk much about Watts' tenure in WCW or WWF in the 90s, other than he worked in both places, and called his Mid-South UWF promotion, which was the third largest company in American pro wrestling in 1987 when he sold it to Jim Crockett Jr., innovative as it pertained to television wrestling. Today's Raw has a lot of similarities to mid-80s USWA and Mid-South, but with backstage elements and major entertainment trappings thrown in. Watts did use women in angles including Sunshine, Missy Hyatt, and Dark Journey, and they dressed provocatively for the time, but their fashion styles appear time if compared to the women in wrestling today. There was steroid use in Mid-South wrestling. Watts did speak out against it, but he also didn't stop promoting people with good or great physiques. He did run into problems in WCW when wrestlers failed a steroid test and he was unable to punish them. His shows were, by the standard of the time, more violent than most wrestling shows, although certainly the violence was more realistic, and if someone was hit in the face with a baseball bat, it was a major angle leading to an injury, and not something they get up from without a scratch. The wrestlers in the FX Tough Man Contest show were all paid $1,000. The show was really bad. The football players team consisted of ex-players from various minor league teams, including one guy who looked to be about 420 pounds and most of whom weren't in anywhere near the shape of the wrestling team, all except for one of which were from Rick Baseman's Ultimate Pro Wrestling promotion. Even though the rounds were only 1 minute, most of the footballers were gassing out in 30 seconds and virtually nobody had any boxing skills. Stefan Gamlin, 6'7" and 289 pounds, who actually played pro football in Europe and later had a developmental deal with the WWF and was sent to Ohio Valley Wrestling where he had a few matches and didn't make the grade, ended up being the big winner of the tournament, winning decisions over the blubbery 420-pound Chris Kinnebrew and Kevin Smith, the latter a 310-pound former lineman with the Los Angeles Dragons. Harrison Norris, the wrestler suing WCW, who is experienced at this and something of a ringer, and this was put together to showcase since he was under contract with Art Door, who promotes the show and also does the ring announcing, and was added to the wrestling team, put together by Ultimate Pro Wrestling in Southern California, pretty much against their will, was shown in 2 quick knockout wins, and in a third fight he also knocked his foe out, but it was after the bell and was disqualified. They also showed Tim Fisher, Damian Steele formerly of XPW, getting knocked out, as well as Aaron Aguilera, who had just signed a developmental deal with the WWF, fighting Kinnebrew, and getting knocked out. The wrestlers won 190-50. Honky Tonk Man was the coach for the wrestling team while former NFL Colts star Conrad Dobler coached the football team. On the June 21st TV tapings for Memphis Championship Wrestling, Steve Regal won the Southern title from Jerry Lawler due to interference from K-Crush and Viscera. Lawler had Cat in his corner. New to the circuit were Spanky and American Dragon from Shawn Michaels' Texas Wrestling Association. Mean Street Posse remains MCW Tag Champs while in a tournament to crown the first MCW Light Heavyweight Champion. Fabulous Rocker beat Spanky in the finals. Stu Hart, 85, was hospitalized this past week with walking pneumonia but was said to have been doing better at press time. Takamichi Noku will be opening up a wrestling school called Kaientai Dojo in Puerto Rico. Muhammad Hussein, real name Lou Fabiano, returned to Puerto Rico where he had been a long